My name is Sean Wilkie. I'm the CEO of Talkatoo, a company that's really passionate about giving veterinarians more time back in their day. I've got a friend of mine from the other side of the pond. I'm from Nova Scotia, so I typically say that. Dr. Anthony Chadwick is with us today, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Many of you probably don't know this, but Anthony kind of single-handedly kind of kicked off this world of online education for the veterinary field before anybody else was doing it. The webinar vet is, I guess, how people know you around the world. And Anthony is the CEO of Alpha Vet International. He's a veterinary dermatologist, so he comes to this field of online education kind of after been a veterinarian for a large portion of his life. A captivating guy, an incredibly tall guy. I still can't get over how tall you are. You actually make people like me, who's 6'3", actually feel quite short, which doesn't happen a lot. I was at a concert last night, Anthony, and you'll be happy to know that I was able to look over everybody's head. It's a good thing you weren't there because you would have blocked my view. And yeah, I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the last 3 years. We keep running into each other, and you're passionate about this topic that we're going to talk about today, about environmental sustainability, what it means for the veterinary industry, and not just that, but what it means from the perspective of running a better business, one that allows you to attract more clients, have more engagement. And when we spoke about this, I think it was first at London Vet Show, about how passionate you are about this work and how meaningful it was to you. I really wanted to give you the platform to kind of share that view with people on this side of the world, because I do think that there is some very self-serving elements of this work and this way of thinking that can bring value to people's businesses, bring more customers in the door. And I wanted to give you the platform to kind of share that. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you to share your screen and get us kicked off.
Thanks so much, Sean. And, I agree. I am the wrong person to stand behind at concerts or at football. I'm a big Liverpool supporter, and I must admit the people behind me don't like me that much. But I duck down and hopefully they get to see the goals. So, yeah, you're right. This is a real area that I'm terribly passionate about. It's how do we look at the planet and how do we start as individuals and as business people to make a difference. But what's really exciting about this now, Sean, is that it's becoming even more sensible from a financial perspective as well, which hopefully I'll be able to convince you of as we go through the talk. And I wanted to start talking about sparrows, because sparrows are actually a big part of why I became a vet. I'm a vet, obviously, a veterinarian. I love animals. And one of my first memories is growing up in Anfield by the two football grounds. Liverpool have two famous teams, Liverpool FC and Everton. I support Liverpool. And the ground is quite close to where I was brought up in Priory Road. And the road was a tree-lined road. And I can remember growing up as a small boy, and one of the things that captivated me very early in my life was listening to the sparrows. And they would wake me up in the morning. They would be chirping in the trees outside. We had a lovely, beautiful tree-lined road. And I would go to school and I would see the sparrows scurrying on the concrete pavements. I'm in quite an urban area. It's not rural, but there were lots of sparrows around. And then Dutch elm disease came into the country, and the trees became diseased and had to be cut down. And I started to hear the sparrows less. And also, it's critical for why I became a vet, because quite close to where I lived was my junior school. Myself and a friend were running around the playground, and actually my friend stepped on a baby sparrow as he was running, and he killed the sparrow. And I remember thinking at that time, gosh, if I'd have been a vet, I might have been able to save the sparrow's life. So sparrows have been a really important part of my life. Actually, what's really sad is this picture on the left is a house sparrow. It's very common in the UK. I believe you have them in America and Canada that have come over on the ships and so on. And in my lifetime, I've just recently celebrated my 57th birthday. We've lost about 50 million sparrows in the UK. The UK is the most nature-denuded country in the G7, and it's the least wooded in Europe. And so when those trees were cut down, it makes a difference. My other passion is speaking. I love to present. As vets, we present every day, we do the job. But I actually did some qualifications, Guildhall School of Music and Drama as I was growing up. And one of my topics that I talked about was conservation. I was doing conservation talks 40 odd years ago when it really wasn't as popular. And the particular talk that I gave on conservation, I talked about this chap on the right, who is the dusky seaside sparrow. A sparrow that at one time was very common in Florida. I've just come back from the VMX conference, and not too far from where that is, by Cape Canaveral, was this dusky seaside sparrow. And habitat was lost, pesticides were used in that area. And when I was doing my presentation in the mid-80s, the dusky seaside sparrow was critically endangered, and there was talks about how they could rescue this species and make it thrive again. And unfortunately, the Floridian authorities had no success with that. And in fact, the last dusky seaside sparrow was seen in the early 90s, and it is now an extinct species. So we've lost the dusky seaside sparrow, and I think that matters. For me, it matters because the world is that little bit poorer as we lose species. And just recently been at a conference, hearing that there are species going extinct every day, and some of them we haven't even categorized. We think there's probably about 8 to 10 million species in the world, and we think that we're losing probably 5 to 10 a week. So it's something that we should be really concerned about. And, obviously I'm really interested to hear the perspective from across the pond. But from this side of the pond, there are obviously big issues. We've seen wildfires, even in the centre of, or at the outskirts of London last summer. Droughts are becoming more common, but coincidentally and kind of paradoxically, so are floods. Pakistan flooded last summer, and over 30% of Pakistan was underwater at one time, and that kind of beggars belief. We're continuing to cut down forests. The Amazon at the moment, we believe, is now emitting more carbon than it absorbs, which is a worry. And we just have to start to think about doing some things differently. And it's gratifying, certainly in the UK, to see that more and more cars are being run as electric cars rather than petrol cars. And obviously it's not the perfect solution, but if we can move away from petrol and gas, then that is something that we really need to start looking at seriously. And the reason we need to do it is I was at one of our webinar vet talks a year or two ago, and we had a psychiatrist speaking as part of a Royal College veterinary surgeon symposium that we were running. And she came across a word, and she told me a word which I'd never heard of before, not nostalgia, but solastalgia. And what solastalgia is, it's really an existential dread that the world is going to finish, that the planet is doomed, and what's the point? And therefore there's despair, and people think there's no point in trying to do anything because we can't change it. So let's eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Or they simply just get depressed and stay in bed and have no solution to the problem. And I must admit, I'm a man of hope. I'm an optimist. I believe that we can turn this particular ship around because we as humans are great problem solvers. We've been doing it for centuries. And to give you an example, of course, I'm sure you'll all have heard of the great horse manure crisis of 1894. In 1894, somebody wrote into the London Times and said that by present reckoning, within 20 years, London and many cities across the world would be about 10 foot deep in horse manure. And it would be kind of difficult to get around, or at least it would be rather smelly and uncomfortable if you managed to do it. So much so this created thinking around the globe. Governments began to get together, local governments often. And in 1898, across the pond in New York, they held a conference which was all about how to solve this horse manure problem. It was an 11-day conference, but actually after 4 days, the conference broke up because people could see no way that this problem could be solved. And of course, within 10 years, the problem was solved, not by governments, interestingly, because I think government often is not the most creative, but it was actually solved by clever people like Henry Ford, Daimler and Benz, Rolls and Royce, who invented the motor car. Obviously, it's now created maybe a slightly different problem, but the problem of horses soiling the streets disappeared very quickly. So I think there is reasons to be hopeful, and I hope at the end of the talk you're feeling even more hopeful. Little bit about me, as Sean said, I'm a veterinary surgeon qualified from my hometown of Liverpool in the northwest of England in 1990. Managed to get a certificate, a Royal College certificate in veterinary dermatology in 1995. Opened my practice in 97. Did first opinion there, but also traveled doing difficult dermatology cases for vets in the surrounding area, and then moved my practice up the road in 2009. But apart from that, I was always interested in the internet. I saw the potential for that, and I also perhaps thought a little bit differently. From some vets, in that I like to look outside. Excuse me. So I actually went to an internet conference, and at the internet conference, I heard somebody talking about webinars, and I thought, why are we not doing this in the veterinary profession? We often had to go and travel to do our CPD. It was took time, it took money, and I felt that doing a webinar in the evening after we'd all gone to bed, or at lunchtime when we could do it as part of work, would make real sense. And the business took off. By 2011, I actually sold my practice. My mum and dad weren't very well, so I wanted to spend time with them as well. And Webinar Vet has just grown and grown. And we also now own WikiVet, which is for the students. We also look at Simply Vet now, which is a recruitment arm of the business, because the big problem, certainly in the UK, and I think it's a problem all over the world, is there's a shortage of resource of vets. We've got many more pets now post-pandemic. And how can we actually solve that problem? And I like to solve problems. I'm not saying I can solve the whole problem, but it's been fascinating to get involved in recruitment as well and try and help with that big issue. As a business, as Webinar Vet and WikiVet and Simply Vet, we are an investor in the Environment Green accreditation. This is a UK accreditation. Interestingly, though, led by an American lady who's absolutely fabulous and has really helped us to begin to see how our own business can become more green. I kind of sat on my laurels a bit and felt that because I was taking miles off the road for other businesses, that was enough. And I wanted to see how I could do more. We'll talk about carbon in a bit, but we are a carbon negative business. I don't think that's all the answer to the problem of the environment, but I think it's a good start to look at offsetting. And actually what we do for every membership sold in our business, we plant 2 trees, and we've done this for about the last year, 18 months, and we've planted over 7,000 trees. I apologize for my cough. I was at BSAVA last week and I talked too much. So today we're going to talk about how can we be a sustainable practice. And there's an interesting revolution happening in business, that businesses are now talking about how they can be purpose-centered. And actually, I think veterinary practice has done this, certainly for the 20, 30 years I've been in the business, and it'll be interesting to see what you think. I also think that business is changing and that we have to do business in a different way. We've just had several of the banks in trouble again, and we seem to have an economy that booms and busts. And I don't know whether that is really the sort of business that the economy that we should be looking to carry on with in the long term. Obviously, a lot of talk about decarbonisation of our economy and of our countries. And I'll tell you a little bit about certainly what we're doing in the UK. But of course, CO2, carbon dioxide, isn't the only greenhouse gas. And I think it's a really huge area that we can make a difference is in gaseous anesthetics, obviously within the human field, but very much within the veterinary field as well. How can we use our resources better? How can we recycle, reuse? How can we change the law so we don't have to waste as much? Using products in the practice that are environmentally friendly. And then certainly in the UK, we want to create a country that is much more biodiverse. We have large areas of our country that are green, deserts, they're just grass and not a lot else. And then at the end, we'll talk about some of the things that some of the businesses that I see in the UK are doing and how I think it can be a real way to market your practice. Many of our clients are similarly concerned about the planet, and I think they want to work more and more with businesses that seem to give a damn about that as well. I enjoy reading Harvard Business Review, and you can see there that there's an article on making purpose real. How could you actually become a business that was not just about money, but was purpose-centered? And it was fascinating because there was a piece that came out of America about 3-4 years ago. The Business Roundtable are all of the big companies, all of the big CEOs come together, and they very much spent the last 40 years talking about the purpose of a business is to make profit for the shareholders. And in 2019, they actually changed that, and they said that business was bigger than that. It included a commitment to all stakeholders, not just to shareholders, and that business had to work for the environment. It had to work for suppliers, so it couldn't crush suppliers, big business. It had to work for the employees as well, and obviously for the customer or for the client. And that has been a real sea change. We may not think that in a veterinary business because I think we're always being purpose-centered, but it's been a massive change, and it's very much turned around from where we were 40 years ago. And a very eminent economist in America called Milton Friedman, who actually really helped to set the mindset for Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, very much said the purpose of business is to make money, and it's to be very profitable, and it's to make sure that shareholders get a good return. And that thinking has really stayed with us for the last 40 years. And we're starting to see a change because we want to see businesses that actually say, actually, there's other things we need to do, and saving the planet is part of that. How can we live lightly on the planet and help to protect it? And I've just read a book in the last few months, which has been really interesting, by an Oxford economist, an Oxford University economist, called The Donut Economy. And she's very much talking about how do we set our economy such that we live within our ecological means. We understand how much of the planet that we have, and that it's not infinite, that when we take from the planet, there is a cost to that. There's usually in social degradation. And also, how can we make society fairer? Because we seem over the last 10, 20 years to becoming more and more unequal. Certain percentage of the population has most of the money. And how can we actually change that so that we start to be having a fairer society. And I would recommend the book to you. I can't go into it in too much depth here, but I think it very much says that if we do not look after our planet, then obviously social structure will break down. 30% of our country's underwater. We lose a lot of our infrastructure. We can't run the country in the same way that we can now. So how can we mitigate against climate change? And to give you that hope, I think America have been doing some fantastic things for a long time, things that we can learn from in the UK and Canada as well. So I think we can learn from each other. But obviously, with the new president, there was a really tough ask to get it through Senate and the Houses of Representatives, but he managed to do it. The Inflation Reduction Act actually ring-fenced $369 billion for green energy. So this is an area that is becoming more and more popular, not just green energy, but also how can we conserve our energy better by insulation and things like that. But just looking at a whole tranche of areas that this money can go into to tackle climate change. And they reckon that if all of this happens in the next 10 to 15 years, that we'll actually be able to hit one of the goals that we talk about at the COP conferences. I was at COP26 in Glasgow. COP27 was in Egypt. And the goal is within the next 10 years that we actually reduce carbon by 50%. And this bill on its own gets us pretty close to that in America. And obviously, I'm hopeful that businesses will step in and help with the rest. So it's a really hopeful bill. And I was so pleased to see that coming in August in 2022. And it's interesting that, we begin to see businesses beginning to think in a different way. This is a practice in London, looking at how it produces its electricity. It's sourced from renewable sources. It's using better cleaning products. The clothes are made from recycled plastic bottles. The supplier Covetras is now visiting less often, so therefore traveling less, using less mileage. And then even with web hosting, we have a digital business. How do we host our servers so that the environment is protected as well? But I'm going to start with carbon and energy because it's an area that I think we are all obsessing about, talking a lot about carbon. When you listen to COP26 and all the governments coming together, they want to reduce carbon, which I think is really important, and we need to do it. But if we plant the wrong trees in the wrong place, for example, then that will not be a good thing, because we have to also remember that we want a biodiverse planet. We want to be able to go out into our countryside and listen to the birds and see the animals. America has done that very successfully with its national parks. We not so much in the UK, but we can all do more. And so I wanted to talk about carbon and energy because it is something that I'm really interested in, as well as biodiversity. But I've actually set myself a bit of a challenge, certainly in the UK, but I'm happy to extend that into Canada and America. And that is to see 300 practices put solar panels on their roof so that they can help in the decarbonisation process. Because when we talk about getting our energy from renewable sources, and I know in Canada, for example, there's a lot of hydro. So that's coming from the movement of water, which is obviously a really green way of doing things. There is obviously still coal and gas being burnt, and we really do need to start transitioning away from that if we want to keep the temperature within 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees of pre-industrial levels. And this is one of the other targets for COP. And so this particular picture I'm showing you now is the Tesla factory. I think it's in Nevada. It's the biggest solar roof in the world. I think it produces, or it has 30 megawatts of solar panels on it. So it's a truly massive facility. And I think it's interesting, if Tesla is doing this, They are doing it because it makes sense for them economically. And this is what we're finding now. With the war in the Ukraine, many countries are realizing that their energy is not as secure as they thought it would be. And there's actually been a rush, certainly in the UK, to suddenly kind of think, how can we become more energy secure? How can we rely less on oil and gas from oligarchs and dictators? And so there's been a rush into solar powers. And with the cost of energy really accelerating upwards, it now means that solar is a very cost-effective and cost-affordable way of producing energy. To give you my own personal story, I have had solar panels on my roof for about 14 years, solar thermal creating my hot water and solar photovoltaics creating electricity for me. And I've done that for the last 8 years with the photovoltaics, and I got a smart meter a year or so ago. And it's really satisfying when you can see that your house is running purely on sun. You can see that's 3 watts. It often is sitting at 0. I took that photograph about, as you can see, about half an hour ago. And we were running 3 watts in the house. So the solar panels were actually providing the house with the energy that it needed. And we were pulling virtually nothing off the grid. You can also see on the diagram on the right that a few weeks ago, I actually had battery fitted as well. And the battery is fantastic because, of course, in sunny days and when there's ambient light, that will start to charge when there's enough light there. When the solar panels are looking after the house, then suddenly the battery will start to charge as well. And that then provides me with energy in the evening. And we are in March now, obviously not the height of summer in the UK in a northern clime. And I have had several days already this month when I've been able to run my house for 24 hours without actually using any energy from the grid, but also exporting some energy to the grid. So I've been really happy about that. What was really interesting speaking to a solar panel expert in Canada was that, of course, outages are much more common in, Canada and America are huge countries. So outages are more common. We don't have them as much in the UK, although I think there is the potential for that to become more common here as well. So when I just had the battery fitted, I also had another circuit fitted so that if the electricity collapsed and failed in Liverpool, I would still be able to use the battery power that I had to power the house for a short time, to keep my internet up, to keep my computer charged, so that I could continue to run Webinar Vet. Obviously, I have an office in town, but I would be able to run it from home. And so it gives me resilience. And the reason I've done that in my own house is to test out how effective that can be. Because certainly in veterinary practice, if you have an outage and you've got a dog on the table doing a bitch spay, to actually being able to turn to an emergency power source. And I know in Canada, you can even use your cars to do this. It's certainly something that veterinary practice should be thinking about to give it more resilience and to act as an insurance policy. So I'm really encouraging people to think that if more and more practices put solar on their roof, they're then allowing other people to take that sustainable energy that's being produced in other places. And we can, as a profession, really lead the way as a profession into that net zero situation that we want to hit in the next 10 to 20 years. Of course, CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas, and anesthetic gases play a massive part in global warming as well. You may see there that carbon dioxide is given in this chart a global warming potential of 1. Nitrous oxide, which we still use, but less so now in the UK because we've had an advocate called Ellie West who's been encouraging us to use less nitrous oxide. But nitrous oxide is 265 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And then many of us have turned to isoflurane, which has a GWP of 510. But you can see that by changing to sevoflurane, that's about 3 to 4 times less potent greenhouse gas than isoflurane is. So that's part of the solution, but also what we found with the anaesthetists working very hard, Ellie West being one of them, that if we can lower our flow rates and use more rebreathing circuits, then actually we can really reduce our anaesthetic gas usage. Obviously, also basic things like pre-medding, the dog or cat will help us to need less anaesthetic, using regional nerve blocks if necessary, using more injectable anaesthetics like Propoflow and so on. So certainly this is a big area that we can look at. And actually we did, as part of our virtual conference at, I think it was February this year, the Mars veterinary group, which is across the world, actually sponsored a symposium on responsible use of pharmaceuticals, of which anesthetic gases are a part. So if anybody is interested in seeing that symposium, then do get in touch with me at the end of the webinar, and we can sort that out for you. If you actually email office@thewebinarvet.com, I can make sure that you see more of this. I was a dermatologist, not an anaesthetist, and actually it was a vet in Canada, in Toronto, that was giving this talk, from which this slide has come from. And then, so we've talked about carbon, but we also look at resource use. How can we recycle more? Somebody uses a bottle of Metacam in the practice, that they take it home with them for their dog, and inevitably those sort of bottles will often go into the bin. They can't be recycled because they've had medical products in them. That's certainly the case in the UK. So we're in a difficult area to recycle those sort of things. But they probably need to be taken to be burnt. Sinulox with the packs inside can be recycled via TerraCycle. Only about 7 to 9% of medical plastic is recycled. So we should and can be doing a lot better with that. And certainly in the UK, we're starting to look at the foil pouches that you get your pet food in as well, collecting them so that they can be sent back to be recycled. Obviously, the Sinulox, if it comes in cardboard, can we send that back to our wholesaler, or can we make sure that it's recycled correctly? And then making sure that chemicals that we don't want to leach into the environment, so antibiotics, encouraging people, if they don't use them, to bring them back, because if they just flush them down the toilets, we know that there are sewers now where there are bacteria in there where there is antimicrobial resistance. So this is also a part of the picture. It's all part of the One Health thing, that if we don't look after our planet, inevitably it's going to have effects for us in all sorts of different areas. And I use this because, of course, it is one of the key clothes that are worn in America. I wear them myself, and it's been really interesting to see companies like Levi really begin to look at this area and to use less water in producing the blue jeans, but also really cutting down on the harmful chemicals that have been used in the past to make those clothes. And the reason I talk about Amatras is I often had Demodex, dogs with Demodex being presented to me. And the product at the time, 20 years ago, was Amatras, but I knew that that product was so toxic, it wasn't really great for the nurses who were applying it or the owners. If it got into the water courses, it could cause a lot of damage to the animals in the water, the fish and the invertebrates. And so I was very keen to limit the use of Amatras as much as possible, and to use other alternatives, at that time off-label drugs like ivermectin, as long as obviously I had a signed consent form, as long as I wasn't using in collie dogs, where of course ivermectin could kill them. But it's beginning to think about, how do you work in your practice using products that potentially can be harmful if they get into the environment, and how can we be using them differently? And of course, part of that is, the eco-friendly cleaning products. I think if we talk about this as well in practice, that we are using products that are safe for the environment, safe for us. I'm sure we all remember some of the chemicals that we were spraying in the practice. They would hit the back of your throat a bit like the cough I've got at the moment. And there are many sort of alternatives out there that we can start looking at. So you will know the products that you have available in your countries, but I would encourage you, this is really an area that we can also make sure that we're using the most eco-friendly products for washing sheets and so on. And when we're talking about resource use, can we recycle our drapes that we use for the operations rather than using single-use ones that end up being thrown away and are, of course, incredibly expensive? So I know there have been studies done, certainly in the UK, where by using reusable products rather than products that we just throw away after one use, economically it's made sense, but it's also helped by reducing the amount of plastic that we're producing. And we all know that plastic has been a really useful product, but it lasts so long, it lasts for centuries, that the stuff that we are producing really doesn't get degraded. So we have to start looking at alternatives to plastic. The problem at the moment is that from a government perspective, we can't even use recycled plastic in the UK for putting our drugs in. It has to be virgin plastic. So there needs to be a change in the law before we can really move forward with that. And I'll be interested to know what the situation is in Canada and America. Biodiversity is important from so many ways. Obviously, as vets, we can really influence what farmers are doing. We know in the UK that we've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows since the Second World War. And we've ended up with a green monoculture of grass. We obviously have a lot of sheep in the UK, and sheep crop the grass so tight that really nothing else can grow. And that means that our insects have less places to go to pollinate. A German study that was done a few years ago showed that the population of insects in Germany had dropped by about 40% in 40 years. So it's a real precipitous loss. And if we lose all of our insects, then actually pollinating our crops is going to be really difficult. And if you want to look at the future, go to Japan, because Japan has had a real drop off in their bees and so on. And they are now pollinating by hand and also using robots and so on. So I don't think this is a situation we want to get to. What are the chemicals that we're using in farming? How can we make sure that we use them sensibly? How can we make sure that we set aside land for farming, but also just as wilderness, to make sure that we have these wild areas where insects and all the animals that depend on insects can flourish? There has been a controversy in the UK around some of the small animal ectoparasiticides that we use because they've been found in rivers. And we don't think that that's coming from crop use. Drugs like imidacloprid have now been banned in the UK and in the EU, although there are certain derogations. But we need to look at how they will affect rivers, other areas. Are they damaging our insects that do us good as well? And I think the jury's still out on that. I know there are studies going on, but that's certainly an area that we maybe need to start looking in the UK. Do we treat just prophylactically, as I did in my practice with pet health schemes, or do we begin to start treating as necessary? Mike Willard, one of my favorite lecturers from Canada, Texas A&M, used to talk about what he told you 10 years ago was a lie. He just didn't realize. So we learn from our mistakes, and it may be that will be an area certainly controversial in the UK. Do we need to change our perspective on some of these ectoparasiticides that we're using? To give you some sort of good news stories that are going on at the moment, I think the first thing is for us to start to have that mindset. As I suggested before, we often talk about the triangle of vet, owner, and pet, and how we make our decisions collectively. I think if we turn that into a square and add the environment in and just rather than have separate conversations, think about some of the products that we're using. Think about, can we recycle more? Keep the owner informed of that, because I think many owners will want to hear that you are interested and wanting to make an effort. I think can be really effective. I think it's also good within all the bad news that we have. We see the newspapers and we go on the internet, there's loads of bad news. It's really important to tell these good news stories. So the fact that we've planted 7,000 trees in the last 18 months, I think is a good news story. I know we can be accused of greenwashing, and I speak to a lot of bigger firms and they say, we don't want to talk about it because we don't want to be accused of greenwashing. But I think with the amount of bad news that is out there, we're duty bound to tell hopeful, optimistic stories that actually raise people's spirits. So I would encourage you to start doing things and tell people about them. And it is a journey. None of us are perfect. I'm not perfect environmentally either. But by taking small steps, it then leads us to other things that we can do as well. Pets at Home, I think, is a big group in America as well, but it's doing a lot of really good work in the UK. It has a partnership with the Woodland Trust to plant trees. It also is using more eco-conscious pet accessories, so it's moving away from plastic or using recycled plastic. In the UK, we have the Investors in the Environment Award that I was telling you about before, that's run by an American lady. And for practices to go through that from bronze, silver to gold, to green, it's a really interesting exercise because it helps us to measure carbon, look at some of the things we're doing. How are we recycling? Can we improve on that? And, you know, we all as individuals and as businesses need to lower the amount of energy that we use, the amount of carbon that we produce. And we think about 50% in the next 10 years, which sounds like a huge amount. But if we actually start doing that 5% a year, it becomes a lot more manageable. And saving carbon is easy, you know, okay, put the solar panels on, but also making sure you turn your computers off, using LED lighting, having better insulation in the building so we're not wasting energy. These are all very easy areas that we can do that can make a huge difference if we all do it. So we shouldn't forget the effectiveness of one person doing it, but if numbers of people come together, then it becomes even more effective as well. And we encourage each other. Want to tell you about some of the things that we've been doing. We hosted our first sustainability summit in 2022. We repeated that again in 2023. And we had on a Wednesday afternoon, over 300 people at the first one and 450 people at the second one. People from all over the world, obviously a lot from the UK, but this is becoming more mainstream. And we've also held Veterinary Green Awards in the UK as well to recognise some of the great work done by individuals and also practices. And this is something that if you're not doing in America and Canada, it's something you can consider. As I've said, Investors in the Environment is the mark that we use in the UK. There are other marks like the Carbon Trust. I'm sure there are similar organizations in North America as well. As I said, I actually wanted to give you an example of one of the businesses that are already working. And I spent some time with Hills last year seeing what they were doing, and I was really impressed. They want to have all their energy from renewable sources by 2030. To be net zero by 2040. And actually, in this last decade, when nobody was really watching, they were able to reduce their carbon by 14%. In the next 10 years, probably they need to take that down 50%, but they're obviously already out on the track. They've got their training shoes on, and they are already making a difference. Within their resource use, 65% of all cardboard packaging was recycled material in 2019. And they're doing more to reduce waste in their manufacturing, so that they often have factories that are actually conserving water, and the plastic that they have is relatively easy to recycle. But I am encouraging them to start to actually have places in practice where people can take their pouches, so that those pouches get recycled as well, because there is a move away from aluminium, which of course could be recycled almost infinitely. And then within the biodiversity, it was really good to see that the High Seas Treaty was signed just a few weeks ago to really try and protect the oceans so that fish stocks can be sustainable. 30% of the ocean will be given over for sustainable growth of the fish. And then this allows us to continue to fish at a sustainable level. If we just remove all the fish from the ocean, in the North Atlantic, it was overfished and it's never quite got back to where we wanted to get to. So it's great to see that Hills are using fish from sustainable sources. And this is something we can do personally when we go to our supermarkets, to look at food that's coming from ethically sourced, but also from a welfare perspective as well. Marketing your practice, we talk a lot in the practice about the fact that we are carbon negative to our clients, to the vets who use Webinar Vet and Simply Vet. We're an investor in the environment business, which we've got for the second year running. So it shows that we're committed to that. These pictures here show the wildflower meadow that we've actually planted close to the Liverpool Science Park, where our offices are. And you can see there that within a short time, we were getting crickets in as well, which is really satisfying. If you haven't heard, do look up Vet Sustain. They've come up with a really fantastic greener veterinary practice checklist. We're not going to do all these things immediately. They are things that we can start building towards. The journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. And for me, the key is that we make a step. In my particular business, I encourage all the team to look at the particular UN development goal that means the most to them. And for me, life on land and life below water and climate action have been the three that I want to really look at. But actually, they are all connected. If we can get the environment better, then it's likely that we'll be able to start working towards reducing poverty as well. So thank you so much. I hope that's been useful. I hope you've been able to take maybe some of those points. As I say, always with a webinar, I always like to make sure that there's one or two points that people can take away and use in their practice. So happy to take any questions, happy to discuss any of those points with you, Sean. So over to you, and I'll stop sharing.
Well, thanks so much for sharing the information. We do have a couple of questions from the guests that are here. I think the one that stood out to me the most is, how am I, as a busy vet, supposed to implement any of this into my current practice?
I think it's making sure, that you have a good support team who can help you with it. I absolutely get that. I mean, one of the things I've done in the UK is I am now chatting to practices and saying, I have found somebody who's really good at doing solar panels, for example. Now I get a small commission from that. But I think you're right, it's finding the right suppliers so that you're not going into the wrong places. But some of this, as we said, is saving you money. So LED lighting, if you have lights that you need to replace, LED lighting will pay back very quickly. And that is just simply a case of getting in touch with your electrician and saying, is this something that we can do? Maybe we do it in a few of the rooms first, because it's, I am a vet as well. I understand how busy everybody is. So, getting the electrician in to change some of those lights, is I think really possible. I know solar panels and the way that energy is kind of produced and moved around in America and New York and Canada is different than in the UK. But I think solar, battery plus solar plus maybe extra circuitry will give you that resilience in your business. And these are all important issues. And I know they're not urgent, because the urgent stuff is the cesarean that's just come through your door. But if that cesarean comes through your door and all the lights go off, and you're in the middle of an op and you don't have a fallback mechanism, then I think, it's important for us to start to look at, as energy is becoming a bit more difficult to predict, that it's always going to be there with outages and so on.
Yeah, and I can really
I think
appreciate.
it's really important that you put those insurance policies in place. We don't wait until we have a bad diagnosis from our doctor before we do life insurance, or at least the sensible among us do that. So I think it's being able as vets, and we're not always that good at it, is passing stuff on, building up a really strong team that you trust, that you can actually set on a project and say, we've got a certain budget here, let's get it organized. And if you've got trusted suppliers, then these are things that I think can be done without really interfering with the running of the practice.
Yeah, it makes tons of sense. I got another question here for you, Anthony. What role do you think vet schools have in playing in environmental sustainability, function in the veterinary sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's massive, and we're going to be running the Veterinary Green Discussion Forum again, where we try and bring all of the companies together in the UK with some European input as well. And part of that is the universities, and we didn't get that many last year, and we're hoping to get more this year. I think it's from a couple of angles. More and more of the younger people actually are really committed to the environmental, the environmental message. So if they are not doing something about it, they're probably going to struggle to maybe fill up their classes. But also from the point of view of the practices or the universities, that are talking to perhaps their students who aren't getting it. I think as universities, but also as practices, we are well trusted within the community. And if people see, the veterinary practice or the university making a real commitment to sustainability, having solar panels on their roof, using, the most energy efficient boilers, maybe using air source heat pumps. Universities, I think, should be places of learning and places that take us to the next stage, that actually teach us where the future is leading. So they, I think, really need to be at the forefront of this, because this is such a crucial decade. And more people that are involved in it, the better. And I suppose within the actual lecturing of things, I do wonder whether we need to look at, for example, cattle production. Certainly in the UK, when I did cattle medicine in my first 2 years of qualifying, cows were pushed very hard to produce lots of milk. But after 3 or 4 years, they were culled. And often these cows were given wheat and cereals to eat to convert into milk and to beef. Whereas actually we know that, that conversion process is quite wasteful. Should cows just be eating grass? Obviously, we accept that will produce less meat and less milk, but perhaps the quality of the meat will be better and the welfare of the animal will be better. So these are areas that I think we do need to look at. I'm not saying I'm an expert in that area. I spent the first few years of my veterinary life working in mixed practice. But I don't think we should be afraid of answering those questions, because sometimes, the profession can be conservative. This is the way we've always done things. Therefore, this is the way that we will always do them. I don't think is fit for purpose for the 21st century. So we have to look at different ways of doing things. For example, some of the work that's been done in universities has discovered that putting seaweed on cattle feed massively reduces the amount of methane that they produce, which is a greenhouse gas. And I think this is the area that universities can help in massively in researching in these areas as well, and really putting efforts in. I was about 2 weeks ago at the opening of a new vet school in the UK called Keele Harper Adams. And Keele has been named as the most sustainable most sustainable university in the UK. So it's great to see that universities are realizing that this is an important area, but it's also an area that there's loads of research money. You know, as we said before, 369 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm sure universities wouldn't mind a little piece of that pie as well. So it just makes sense as we're moving into low carbon technology that universities are really at the forefront of that as well.
Well, sir, we've chewed through all the time. We've got to promise to everybody that joined the webinar to contain this within an hour. Yeah. I want to thank you for taking this perspective to our audience, and wish you a pleasant rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thanks everyone for listening. And if any of you are interested in a couple of those webinars that I referenced during the talk, please do email office@thewebinarvet.com. Those of you might be listening after this broadcast. Similarly, if we can help, I'd love to help.
Awesome. Thanks, Mr. Chadwick.
Take care. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.